What if the greatest secret humanity ever buried is not lost, but returning? What if, right now, beyond the edge of our skies, something ancient is sending a signal? Not to scientists, not to governments, but to history itself. Before we go any further, let me ask you this. If an object in deep space suddenly began behaving in ways no natural body should, would you trust what you're told about it? Or would you wonder what's being left unsaid? For centuries, ancient civilizations warned that the sky was not empty, that the heavens were not silent, and that the gods did not simply vanish, they withdrew. Names changed over time, myths were dismissed as symbolism, and forbidden knowledge was reclassified as legend. Yet one name refused to disappear completely: Nibiru, a wandering world, a returning presence, a celestial body linked not only to catastrophe, but to creation itself. And now, a modern anomaly known as 3I Atlas is forcing uncomfortable questions back into the open. Officially, 3I Atlas is described as just another interstellar object, a strange traveler passing through our cosmic neighborhood. But nothing about its behavior feels ordinary. Its trajectory, its timing, and the sudden surge of attention around it have reignited debates long thought settled. Some researchers quietly admit that its movement does not align with known natural patterns. Others avoid the topic altogether, because once you say the word signal, you imply intention, and intention suggests intelligence. Ancient Sumerian records spoke of the Anunnaki, beings who descended from the heavens, shaped early civilization, and departed with a promise to return when the signs in the sky appeared again. These were not vague prophecies. They described cycles, celestial alignments, and a returning marker that would signal the end of one era and the beginning of another. For generations, these texts were dismissed as myth. But what if they were never meant to be understood until the technology existed to recognize the signal? Across history, moments of sudden collapse, unexplained resets, and lost civilizations appear to follow a pattern. Empires fall, knowledge vanishes, humanity starts again, unaware that it has done so before. Many believe Nibiru was central to these cycles, a planetary body whose return coincided with global transformation, not just destruction, but reordering, rewriting the rules of existence. And now, for the first time in modern history, instruments are detecting something that echoes those ancient descriptions. The unsettling part is not that something is moving through space, it's that this event feels familiar, as if humanity has lived through this moment before, only to forget it afterward. The Anunnaki were described not as mythological gods, but as watchers, architects, and overseers. They arrived when humanity was young, guided its early development, and vanished once their work was complete, or so we're told. But ancient texts hint that they never truly left. They simply retreated, waiting for the right signal to return. If 3I Atlas is merely a rock drifting through space, then history remains intact. But if it is something more, a marker, a messenger, or even a probe, then everything we think we know about our past and our future begins to unravel. Why now? Why this timing? And why do ancient warnings align so precisely with modern detection? As you listen, consider this carefully. If an ancient civilization wanted to leave a message for the future, would they carve it in stone or place it in the stars, knowing only a technologically advanced humanity would recognize it? And if the signal is real, the question is no longer whether Nibiru exists, but what happens when the ones who left are finally ready to be seen again. And before we go any deeper into what this signal may truly represent, there's something important I need to ask of you. This is not the kind of story you listen to passively. The ideas unfolding here challenge what we think we know about history, about humanity, and about our place in the universe. So take a moment to really absorb what's being said. Understanding this content is essential, because once you start connecting these pieces, it becomes impossible to see our past the same way again. If what you're hearing is making you question official narratives, ancient myths, or even the silence surrounding events like this, let me know. I want you to pause for a second and share your thoughts in the comments. Do you believe this signal is natural or intentional? Do you think ancient civilizations knew something we were never meant to remember? Simply comment what you're thinking right now. Even a short message like "the signal is real" or "history repeats" helps keep this conversation alive. Leaving a like on this video is more than just support for the channel. It tells the algorithm that this kind of deep, thoughtful content matters, and it helps this discussion reach others who are also searching for answers beyond the surface. When you like the video, you help keep these hidden stories visible instead of buried like they have been so many times before. And if this is your first time here, consider subscribing. This channel is dedicated to uncovering forgotten histories, ancient warnings, and the mysteries that connect our past to what may be approaching us now. By subscribing, you make sure you don't miss the next part of this investigation, because what we're about to explore next goes even deeper into the evidence, the patterns, and the secrets many believe were never meant to resurface. Stay with me. What comes next may change the way you see the sky, the past, and the future itself. The idea that this signal exists at all is what makes it so disturbing, not because humanity has never detected strange objects before, but because this one doesn't fit comfortably into any category we already understand. As the data emerged quietly at first, it challenged assumptions that had gone unquestioned for decades. Movements that appeared deliberate rather than random, timings that aligned too precisely with known cosmic cycles, and subtle irregularities that suggested this was not simply another piece of debris wandering through space. The deeper analysts looked, the more uncomfortable the silence around it became. What makes a signal truly unsettling is not its strength, but its intent. Natural objects behave according to predictable laws. They drift, they decay, they follow gravity without purpose. But this anomaly appeared to react, to adjust, almost as if it were aware of its surroundings. That alone forces a difficult question. At what point does coincidence become design? And more importantly, who benefits from pretending there is no difference between the two? Throughout history, moments like this have always been accompanied by denial. When ancient civilizations observed strange movements in the sky, they didn't see chaos. They saw communication. They believed the heavens spoke in patterns, not words, and that only those paying close attention would understand the message. This belief wasn't superstition to them. It was survival. Entire calendars, rituals, and power structures were built around the idea that celestial events were warnings, not accidents. And among all those warnings, one stood apart from the rest. The records that speak of Nibiru do not describe a random planet. They describe a returning presence, one that moves on a long, calculated cycle, visible only at certain moments in human history. According to these accounts, its appearance was never sudden. It was preceded by signs, disturbances in the sky, unusual lights, changes in the behavior of other celestial bodies. In other words, signals. To the ancients, these signs were unmistakable. They meant that the watchers were turning their attention back toward Earth. This is where the modern discomfort truly begins, because the characteristics described in those ancient texts are uncomfortably similar to what is now being observed. Not identical, not obvious enough to force immediate action, but close enough to provoke quiet concern. The signal doesn't announce itself. It whispers. It exists just at the edge of what can be dismissed, creating plausible deniability for those who would rather not explain it. And perhaps that's the most chilling aspect of all. If this signal were overwhelming, loud, impossible to ignore, the world would be forced to react. But subtle signals are easier to bury, easier to classify, rename, and file away under harmless labels. That strategy has worked before. It has allowed entire chapters of human history to be erased, rewritten, or reduced to myth. And it raises the possibility that this isn't the first time humanity has faced something like this, only the first time we're beginning to remember. The Anunnaki, according to ancient accounts, were not gods in the way later religions would define them. They were beings of authority, knowledge, and presence. They arrived from the sky, established order, altered humanity's path, and left behind instructions meant to endure beyond memory. Their departure was not permanent. It was conditional. They would return when the signs appeared again, when humanity reached a point where it could once more recognize what it was seeing. That idea reframes the signal entirely. Instead of asking what it is, we are forced to ask who it is for. Signals are meant to be received, and if this one exists, then someone, somewhere, is meant to notice it. The question is whether humanity is the intended recipient, or merely the subject being observed. There's also the unsettling alignment of timing. Humanity is at a crossroads, technologically advanced, yet historically fragmented, more connected than ever, but increasingly disconnected from its origins. Ancient knowledge is being rediscovered, translated, and re-examined at the same time. Our instruments are reaching farther into space than ever before. It's as if two timelines are converging, one ancient, one modern, meeting at this exact moment. That alone should give us pause. Some believe the signal is a test, a threshold, a way of measuring whether humanity is ready to confront the truth of its past. Others believe it is simply an announcement, subtle by design, allowing those who are paying attention to prepare, while others remain unaware. And then there are those who fear it is neither, that it is instead a marker, counting down a cycle that cannot be stopped, only endured. What's rarely discussed is how deeply this idea is embedded in ancient warnings. They speak of cycles of creation and collapse, of humanity rising, forgetting, and rising again. Each cycle ends not with total annihilation, but with selective survival. Knowledge is lost, memory fades, the story resets, and the watchers move on, satisfied that the balance has been restored. If that pattern is real, then the signal is not a threat. It is confirmation that humanity has reached the same point it has reached before, confirmation that the old mechanisms are activating again, and confirmation that whatever once shaped our world may be preparing to do so again, not out of malice, but out of function, as if history itself is governed by rules far older than civilization. What makes this difficult to accept is not fear, but humility. It requires acknowledging that humanity may not be the first advanced society on this planet, that our achievements, impressive as they are, may be echoes of something that came before, and that our understanding of the universe may still be guided by frameworks intentionally left behind, waiting to be rediscovered at the right moment. As you continue listening, pay attention to how this idea makes you feel, not just curiosity, but recognition, that quiet sense that some part of this feels familiar, even if you can't explain why. That reaction may be more important than any data point or theory, because if the signal truly shouldn't exist, yet does, then the real mystery is not in the sky, it's in us. Before we move deeper into what this signal may lead to, I want to hear from you. Scroll down and leave a comment with the words, "I see the pattern," or "The signal is intentional," if this resonates with you. Your perspective matters here, and reading your thoughts helps shape where this exploration goes next. And if this story is making you think differently about ancient history, the Anunnaki, or the possibility of repeating cycles, make sure to like the video so more people can join this conversation. If you're still watching at this point, consider subscribing, because what we're about to uncover next builds directly on this moment, and it goes even further than most are prepared for. When the name 3i Atlas first began circulating, it didn't sound threatening. It sounded technical, sterile, almost boring. Just another designation, another object catalogued, another line added to an ever-growing list of things passing through space. And that, perhaps, was the point. Names like this are designed to calm, not alarm. They reduce mystery into acronyms, turning the unknown into something that feels controlled. But beneath that neutral label lies the reason so many people behind the scenes became uneasy long before the public ever heard about it. To understand why 3i Atlas causes discomfort, you have to understand what scientists expect from the universe. Space is vast, but it is not random. Objects follow patterns. Their behavior can usually be predicted, modeled, and explained within existing frameworks. When something appears that refuses to behave as expected, it creates friction, not excitement. Friction. Because friction means explanations must change, and changing explanations threatens authority, funding, and long-standing assumptions about how reality works. What immediately stood out about 3i Atlas was not just that it was interstellar, but that it didn't move like a passive visitor. Its path suggested purpose rather than chance. Its approach lacked the chaotic signatures usually associated with natural objects drifting between star systems. Instead, it felt measured, calculated, almost cautious, as if it were not simply passing through, but arriving at a specific moment for a specific reason. That alone was enough to spark quiet conversations that never made it into official statements. In scientific culture, nervousness doesn't show itself through panic. It shows itself through restraint, through vague language, through an unusual lack of detail where detail should exist. When experts begin speaking in softened terms, when explanations feel intentionally incomplete, it often signals that the truth is more complex than what can safely be shared. And with 3i Atlas, that restraint became noticeable very quickly. The deeper concern lies in comparison. When analysts began comparing this object to everything humanity has previously catalogued, it refused to fit neatly anywhere. It wasn't behaving like a comet. It didn't fully match asteroid models. And it certainly didn't resemble debris expelled randomly from another star system. Each comparison removed certainty rather than adding it. And uncertainty, especially at this level, is dangerous because it opens the door to questions science is not comfortable answering. This is where ancient history quietly re-enters the conversation. Long before telescopes, civilizations watched the skies with an intensity modern society has largely forgotten. To them, the heavens were not distant, they were active, alive, their movements carried meaning. And among those ancient observers, the Sumerians were uniquely specific. They didn't just describe stars and planets, they described visitors, watchers, objects that returned on long cycles, disrupting the natural order of the world each time they appeared. The parallels are difficult to ignore. 3i Atlas arrives not as a blazing announcement, but as a subtle anomaly. Exactly the kind of arrival ancient texts describe. Not dramatic enough to cause immediate panic, but strange enough to signal that something has shifted. According to those records, the return of certain celestial bodies was never meant to be obvious. It was meant to be recognized only by those who knew what to look for. That recognition is what makes scientists nervous. Because once you acknowledge that an object behaves with intent, you step outside the boundary of traditional astronomy. You enter territory where intelligence, design, and purpose must be considered. And those ideas blur the line between science and something far older, something modern institutions have spent centuries distancing themselves from. Another layer of discomfort comes from timing. Humanity is not observing 3i Atlas during a period of stability. We are living through rapid technological acceleration, global uncertainty, and a renewed obsession with origins. Ancient tablets are being retranslated. Forbidden histories are trending again. The Anunnaki, once relegated to fringe discussions, are now openly debated. It's as if multiple streams of knowledge are converging, all pointing toward the same unsettling possibility, that the past is not as dead as we thought. If the Anunnaki were real, as the texts suggest, then their understanding of the cosmos would far exceed that of early humans. They would have known how to place markers in space, signals that would only be detectable when humanity reached a certain technological threshold. 3i Atlas could be one such marker. Not a message in words, but a presence designed to be noticed, analyzed, and questioned. A cosmic reminder that humanity's story did not begin where we think it did. This idea reframes scientific nervousness entirely. It's no longer about fear of the unknown, but fear of remembering. Fear that modern civilization may be forced to confront evidence that ancient myths were not metaphors, but records, and that our current models of reality are incomplete not because of lack of data, but because of selective forgetting. There is also the issue of control. Knowledge has always been power. If 3i Atlas represents something beyond natural explanation, then no single institution controls the narrative. The truth becomes decentralized, accessible to anyone willing to connect the dots between ancient records and modern anomalies. That loss of control is deeply unsettling for systems built on authority and consensus. As discussions continue quietly, the object remains, moving steadily, indifferent to human discomfort. It does not rush. It does not announce itself. It simply exists, forcing humanity to look up and question whether the universe has always been watching us just as closely as we've begun watching it. What makes this moment so significant is not whether 3i Atlas turns out to be artificial or natural. It's the fact that for the first time in a long time, the official explanations feel less convincing than the ancient ones. And that inversion, where the oldest stories suddenly feel more plausible than the newest theories, is deeply destabilizing. As we move forward, the conversation will inevitably shift. From what 3i Atlas is, to why it is here now. From how it moves, to what it may be signaling, and eventually to whether humanity is prepared to face the possibility that the Anunnaki never truly left, but simply waited for the moment when we could no longer ignore the signs written into the sky. Before we continue, I want to pause here and bring you into this discussion. Scroll down and leave a comment with a phrase like, "This isn't natural," or "Ancient knowledge explains this," if you feel the same unease. Your thoughts matter, and they help guide how deep we go next. If this perspective is opening your mind to connections between ancient civilizations, celestial cycles, and hidden watchers, make sure to like the video so others can find this conversation. And if you're still with me, consider subscribing, because what comes next builds directly on this question, and it leads us even closer to the Anunnaki themselves. There is a reason ancient warnings never sound like clear instructions. They were never meant to be obvious. They were meant to survive time. As the discussion around 3i Atlas grows heavier, something else begins to surface alongside it, not in observatories or data sets, but in memory. Fragments of stories humanity has told itself since the very beginning. Stories that were never framed as history, yet were preserved with an urgency that suggests they mattered more than anyone later understood. These are the echoes we are beginning to hear again. Across early civilizations, from the first city builders to cultures separated by oceans and millennia, there is a recurring pattern, a warning encoded into myth. Not a single event, but a cycle, a return. The sky changing in subtle ways before moments of collapse, transformation, or reset. The ancients didn't describe these events with fear alone. They described them with recognition, as if what they were witnessing had already happened before, long before their own time. What's unsettling is how consistent these echoes are. Different languages, different symbols, different gods. Yet the same underlying message appears again and again. When certain signs appear in the heavens, humanity's position in the world changes. Power shifts, knowledge is lost or redistributed, and those who came from the sky turn their attention back toward Earth. This was not presented as speculation, it was presented as memory. The Sumerians were especially direct about this. They did not speak of their sky beings as abstract forces or metaphors. They spoke of them as entities with intent, hierarchy, and authority. The Anunnaki were not distant creators who vanished into myth. They were administrators of cycles. They arrived, they established order, and they left behind records not for worship, but for remembrance. Their warnings were precise enough to be unsettling, yet vague enough to survive censorship, translation, and time. Those warnings often began the same way, with disturbances, with changes that didn't immediately look catastrophic. Strange movements in the sky, unusual lights, objects that didn't behave as stars or planets should. The texts describe confusion among observers, debates among priests, and a growing realization that something familiar was returning. Familiar not because it was known personally, but because it had been inherited through stories passed down over countless generations. This is where modern listeners often disconnect. We are trained to treat ancient accounts as imagination, symbolism, or attempts to explain natural phenomena. But that assumption ignores something important. Ancient civilizations were far more observant than we give them credit for. Their survival depended on understanding patterns, seasonal, celestial, and environmental. They didn't write stories randomly. They preserved what mattered most. The echoes of warning were not always dramatic. In fact, they were often quiet. A sense that something was out of alignment, that the balance between sky and earth had shifted, that humanity was no longer the sole focus of its own story. This subtlety is what makes those warnings endure. They don't demand belief. They invite awareness. As humanity progressed, these warnings were reshaped. Gods became angels. Watchers became messengers. Celestial cycles became divine judgment or prophecy. But the core message remained unchanged. Something returns. And when it does, the world does not remain the same. The consistency of that message across cultures should not exist if it were purely fictional. Coincidence can explain similarities, but repetition at this scale suggests inheritance. What makes the present moment so uncomfortable is that these echoes are no longer confined to ancient stone or forgotten texts. They are beginning to align with observation. The sense of anticipation described in those records mirrors the unease felt today. Not panic, but awareness. A growing recognition that humanity may be approaching a threshold it has crossed before without remembering the consequences. Ancient warnings rarely focused on destruction alone. That's another misconception. They spoke of separation, of selection, of humanity being divided between those who adapted and those who clung to old understandings. Knowledge was often described as both a gift and a burden. Those who possessed it survived differently than those who didn't. This is why knowledge was guarded, encoded, and restricted, not to control people, but to prevent misuse during unstable times. The Anunnaki, according to these accounts, were not saviors in the modern sense. They were overseers. Their concern was balance, not comfort. If humanity grew too chaotic, too disconnected from its origins, intervention followed. Not necessarily through direct force, but through realignment. A reset that appeared catastrophic to those experiencing it, but necessary within a much larger cycle. This idea challenges everything modern civilization assumes about progress. We believe history moves forward in a straight line. That knowledge accumulates permanently, that once something is learned, it cannot be unlearned. Ancient warnings suggest the opposite. They imply that history loops, that civilizations rise, peak, forget, and repeat, and that forgetting is not accidental. It is part of the process. When those ancient observers looked to the sky and felt dread, it was not fear of annihilation. It was fear of recognition. They understood that the return of certain signs meant humanity would once again be reminded of its place. Not at the center of the universe, but within a system governed by forces far older and more advanced. What makes these echoes so powerful today is that we are no longer dependent on belief alone. Technology allows us to observe the same sky those ancient civilizations watched. We can measure, track, and analyze. And yet, despite all that advancement, the feeling remains the same. Something is off. Something familiar is approaching, and we don't yet know how to respond. This is where modern resistance appears. Accepting these echoes means accepting that ancient knowledge may hold truths modern frameworks cannot explain. It means admitting that humanity's origin story may be incomplete, that the Anunnaki were not simply mythological figures, but participants in a process we are only beginning to rediscover. That idea is deeply destabilizing, not because it is frightening, but because it strips away the illusion of finality. The warnings were never meant to stop what was coming. They were meant to prepare those who could hear them. Preparation did not mean survival at all costs. It meant understanding, awareness, the ability to recognize patterns rather than be overwhelmed by them. In that sense, the echoes we are hearing now are doing exactly what they were always meant to do. They are not shouting. They are resurfacing, quietly, patiently, waiting to see who notices. As we move forward, the question is no longer whether these ancient warnings existed. The question is whether humanity is capable of listening this time. Because the echoes are not just in the sky or in forgotten texts, they are in our collective unease, in the feeling that history is pressing in from all sides, demanding acknowledgement. Before we continue deeper into how these warnings were encoded and why they were meant to endure until now, I want to hear your thoughts. Scroll down and leave a comment with a phrase like, "Ancient warnings were real," or "We've been here before," if this resonates with you. Your perspective adds another voice to this discussion, and if you're finding yourself connecting these ancient echoes with what's happening in the sky today, make sure to like the video so others who feel the same unease can find this conversation. Stay with me, because what comes next builds directly on these warnings and reveals why they were never meant to be forgotten. There is a reason the name Nibiru triggers discomfort long before it triggers curiosity. It is not because the idea itself is implausible, but because it refuses to stay buried. Every time humanity believes it has moved past ancient cosmologies, this name resurfaces, quietly resisting erasure, not as a myth that fades, but as a concept that adapts, waiting for the right moment to be remembered again. And history has made several attempts to forget it. Nibiru was never presented in ancient records as a simple planet drifting harmlessly through space. It was described as a crossing point, a world on a long and deliberate path, intersecting with humanity's timeline rather than merely its orbit. That distinction matters, because planets do not usually carry narrative weight. They do not arrive with consequence. Yet Nibiru was always associated with change, not gradual evolution, but abrupt transformation. The kind that reshapes civilizations and leaves survivors struggling to explain what happened. What makes Nibiru different from other forgotten celestial ideas is the persistence of its description. Across translations, interpretations, and centuries of reinterpretation, certain elements remain consistent. A long orbital cycle, a return after ages of absence, a connection to beings who did not originate on Earth, and most importantly, an association with resets, moments when human history fractured and entire chapters vanished. These details should not align so cleanly if they were the product of imagination alone. The process of erasing Nibiru was not sudden. It was gradual, subtle, and remarkably effective. As modern astronomy developed, older frameworks were reclassified as symbolic or primitive. Stories that once served as records were reframed as allegory. The idea of a returning planet was dismissed as misunderstanding or mistranslation. And with each reinterpretation, Nibiru was pushed further away from legitimacy, until mentioning it alone was enough to trigger ridicule. That is how erasure works best. Not by confrontation, but by conditioning. Yet erasure does not eliminate memory. It fragments it. Pieces remain embedded in myths, religious texts, and cultural warnings that never quite lose their edge. Even when the name Nibiru disappeared, its function remained. Flood myths, sky gods who depart and promise to return. Cycles of destruction, followed by rebirth. These are not isolated stories. They are variations of the same underlying memory, reshaped to survive in different contexts. What history struggled to erase completely was the implication behind Nibiru, because accepting its existence means accepting that humanity has not always been alone in shaping its destiny. It suggests intervention, oversight, a level of cosmic governance that contradicts the modern narrative of human independence. The Anunnaki, often linked directly to Nibiru, were not portrayed as distant deities, but as active participants in human development. That idea alone destabilizes the foundation of accepted history. The discomfort deepens when we consider why Nibiru would need to be erased in the first place. If it were merely a misunderstood planet, there would be no urgency to suppress it. Ideas fade naturally when they lack substance, but ideas that threaten foundational assumptions require active dismissal. Nibiru threatens the idea that humanity's progress is entirely self-driven. It suggests that our leaps forward, agriculture, governance, technology, may have been guided, accelerated, or corrected by external forces. Ancient accounts do not describe Nibiru as benevolent or malevolent. That binary did not apply. It was functional. It arrived when balance was lost, when humanity diverged too far from its intended path. This is not comforting, but it is consistent. The universe described in those records is not emotional, it is procedural. Cycles exist to maintain order, not to preserve comfort. From that perspective, Nibiru is not a destroyer, it is a regulator. This framing explains why its return is always associated with fear and reverence simultaneously. Fear because change is inevitable, reverence because the cycle is understood as necessary. Those ancient civilizations did not worship Nibiru, they acknowledged it, they prepared for it. Their rituals, calendars, and power structures were aligned with celestial timing because survival depended on anticipation, not denial. The modern world, however, is built on denial of cycles. We assume permanence. We build systems that require stability to function. The idea that a single celestial body could disrupt that illusion is deeply unsettling. It challenges not just scientific models, but economic, political, and social structures. That may be the real reason Nibiru was pushed into obscurity, not because it was false, but because it was inconvenient. The irony is that the more history tried to erase Nibiru, the more resilient it became. Suppression turned it into a forbidden concept. Forbidden concepts attract attention. They linger in the margins, waiting for anomalies to bring them back into relevance. And now, as objects like Three-Eye Atlas provoke questions modern explanations struggle to answer, Nibiru feels less like a relic and more like a missing piece. What makes this moment particularly significant is that the erasure is no longer complete. Ancient texts are being revisited with fresh eyes. Translations once filtered through rigid assumptions are being questioned, and technological observation is catching up to ancient description. When the past and the present begin to agree, history loses its ability to dismiss either side. The Anunnaki are central to this reconciliation. They are consistently described as originating from the sky, associated with Nibiru, and responsible for shaping early human civilization. Their departure coincided with a withdrawal of direct guidance. Humanity was left to govern itself, armed with fragments of knowledge and incomplete memory. That explains the uneven progression of civilization: rapid advancement followed by collapse, brilliance followed by forgetting. If Nibiru truly is the planet history tried to erase, then its return would not be announced openly. It would surface gradually, through anomalies, through discomfort, through the re-emergence of ideas long deemed unacceptable. The return would begin in conversation, not catastrophe, in curiosity, not panic, exactly as we are seeing now. What unsettles many people is the realization that erasure may not have been an act of ignorance, but of design. That someone, somewhere, understood the cycle well enough to delay recognition, to buy time, to allow humanity to develop without constant awareness of its overseers. If that is true, then the resurfacing of Nibiru is not accidental. It is timed. And timing implies readiness, or at least inevitability. As you listen to this, notice how the idea of Nibiru feels. Not just intellectually, but emotionally. Does it feel foreign or strangely familiar? Many people report a sense of recognition when encountering this concept, as if they are remembering rather than learning. That reaction is not insignificant. Collective memory does not disappear easily. It waits beneath the surface, resurfacing when conditions allow. Before we move further into how Nibiru connects directly to the Anunnaki and why its return may redefine humanity's future, I want to pause and invite your voice into this. Scroll down and leave a comment with a phrase like, "Nibiru was erased," or "History hid this," if this perspective resonates with you. Even a simple "this feels familiar" helps signal that you're connecting the dots. And if this exploration into erased history and ancient planets is keeping you engaged, make sure to like the video so others searching for these answers can find it too. Stay with me, because what comes next builds directly on Nibiru's role and reveals why its story was never meant to stay buried forever. What truly separates the Anunnaki from every other figure in ancient history is not their power, their symbolism, or even their supposed divinity, but their precision. Ancient records do not describe them as mystical beings guessing at the heavens. They describe entities who understood the sky with an accuracy that feels deeply out of place for the time. This is where the discomfort begins, because mythology can exaggerate many things, but it rarely invents technical consistency without a source. The Anunnaki were repeatedly associated with the stars, not as distant lights, but as structured systems. Their knowledge of celestial cycles appears woven directly into early human society. Calendars, agricultural timing, ritual observances, and political authority were all synchronized with the movement of the heavens. This was not symbolic alignment. It was operational. The sky dictated when to plant, when to rule, when to prepare, and when to wait. That level of coordination implies more than observation. It implies instruction. What is often overlooked is that ancient humans did not casually track complex astronomical patterns. Doing so required long-term observation, mathematical frameworks, and predictive models. Yet ancient civilizations, particularly those linked to Anunnaki narratives, displayed an understanding of planetary cycles that should not have been possible with primitive tools alone. This suggests that the knowledge did not originate with humans, but was transferred to them. Knowledge that was already complete when it arrived. The Anunnaki were described as coming from the sky, but more importantly, they were described as returning to it. That implies origin. You do not return to a place you do not come from. And the descriptions of their home are consistent with the idea of a moving world, one that followed a long and irregular path through the solar system. Their astronomical knowledge was not theoretical, it was personal. They knew the route because they traveled it. This reframes the way ancient texts speak about the heavens. The sky was not mysterious to the Anunnaki, it was familiar. They understood alignments not as abstract events, but as checkpoints, markers along a path. Their knowledge extended beyond Earth's immediate environment, encompassing long cycles that spanned generations of humans. That alone explains why so much of their knowledge was encoded rather than explained. Humans were never expected to fully grasp it immediately. The hidden nature of this knowledge is critical. Ancient records consistently suggest that not everyone was allowed access. Priests, kings, and select initiates were taught fragments, never the whole picture. This was not elitism for its own sake. It was containment. Advanced knowledge, especially knowledge of cycles and returns, can destabilize societies if misunderstood. Knowing that history is cyclical changes how people behave. It undermines authority, permanence, and fear-based control. The Anunnaki seemed acutely aware of this. Their teachings were layered. On the surface, they appeared as gods demanding ritual and obedience. Beneath that, they were engineers of time, aligning humanity with cosmic schedules far larger than any single civilization. The rituals were not worship alone. They were synchronization, a way of keeping human activity aligned with celestial reality, even after direct guidance was withdrawn. One of the most striking aspects of Anunnaki astronomical knowledge is how it integrates Earth into a larger system. Humanity was never portrayed as the center. Earth was one node in a network of worlds. This perspective is radically different from later human-centered cosmologies. It suggests humility, not dominance. Humanity mattered, but only within a broader structure governed by cycles, balance, and return. This worldview explains why the Anunnaki were not concerned with preserving individual civilizations. Civilizations were temporary, cycles were permanent. Their focus was not on empires, but on continuity of process. When a civilization fell out of alignment, it was allowed to collapse. Another would rise, knowledge would fragment and reassemble. From a human perspective, this feels cruel. From a cosmic perspective, it is efficient. What makes this knowledge feel hidden rather than lost is the way it resurfaces repeatedly. Every time humanity reaches a certain level of technological or philosophical development, the same questions emerge. Questions about origins, about visitors, about the sky as more than empty space. This recurrence suggests that the knowledge was never erased entirely. It was seeded, left dormant until humanity was capable of asking the right questions again. The Anunnaki did not leave behind blueprints or machines. They left behind frameworks, ways of thinking, systems that could be rediscovered independently once humanity matured enough to recognize them. This is far more effective than leaving physical artifacts which decay, get buried, or are destroyed. Ideas survive far longer than objects, especially when encoded into culture and myth. Their astronomical knowledge also appears to include awareness of thresholds, points at which observation becomes recognition. When humanity transitions from seeing anomalies as random to seeing them as patterned, this is where we find ourselves now. Objects like 3i Atlas do not shock because they are strange. They disturb because they fit too well into ancient expectations. They feel anticipated. The fear surrounding this knowledge is not fear of aliens. It is fear of continuity. Accepting Anunnaki astronomical knowledge means accepting that humanity's story is part of a much older narrative, that we are participants, not authors, that progress may not be linear, and that forgetting may be as intentional as remembering. This challenges the deepest assumptions of modern identity. There is also the uncomfortable implication that the Anunnaki knew humanity would forget. That forgetting was built into the process. Their knowledge was never meant to remain intact forever. It was meant to decay, fragment, and eventually be rediscovered. This cycle of forgetting and remembering may be the true mechanism by which humanity evolves. Each rediscovery forces re-evaluation. Each loss prevents stagnation. This would explain why their astronomical knowledge feels both advanced and incomplete. It was not designed to be used continuously. It was designed to be found, to awaken curiosity rather than provide answers. In that sense, the Anunnaki did not abandon humanity. They stepped back, confident that the cycle would bring us back to the same questions when the time was right. As you listen to this, notice how the idea of hidden astronomical knowledge reframes everything discussed so far. The signal, the anomalies, the discomfort among modern institutions, all of it fits into a larger pattern of delayed recognition. The sky has always been the message. Humanity is only now learning how to read it again. Before we continue into why this knowledge was concealed so carefully and what happens when it begins to surface openly, I want to hear from you. Scroll down and leave a comment with something like, "They knew the cycles," or "This knowledge was hidden on purpose," if this resonates. Even a simple phrase like, "This explains a lot," helps deepen this conversation. And if this exploration of Anunnaki knowledge and cosmic cycles is keeping you engaged, make sure to like the video so more people who are questioning our origins can find this discussion. We're about to move deeper into why this knowledge was never meant to disappear, only to wait. The idea that Nibiru was never supposed to return is far more unsettling than the idea of its return itself. Ancient accounts do not frame its reappearance as a natural inevitability, but as something conditional, something that only happens when a boundary has been crossed. This immediately shifts the narrative. Nibiru was not a wandering planet acting on blind cosmic mechanics. It was part of a system governed by rules, thresholds, and restraint implies intention. According to the oldest traditions connected to the Anunnaki, Nibiru's cycle was not meant to intersect endlessly with Earth. Its presence was disruptive by design. Each passage altered climates, destabilized societies, and forced humanity into moments of reckoning. These were not accidents, they were consequences. And because of that, the return of Nibiru was treated as something to be delayed, managed, and in some accounts, actively prevented for as long as possible. This is where the tone of the ancient warnings changes. Early records speak openly about Nibiru's role in shaping humanity, but later traditions grow quieter, more cautious. The language becomes indirect, symbolic, as if the subject itself had become dangerous to address plainly. This suggests that at some point, knowledge of Nibiru shifted from being instructional to being forbidden, not because it was false, but because it carried implications humanity was no longer ready to face. The Anunnaki appear at the center of this transition. Their relationship with Nibiru was not passive. They were described as originating from it, navigating its long cycle, and understanding its effects intimately. More importantly, they understood what repeated returns would do to humanity. Each cycle erased progress, fractured memory, and reset civilization before it could fully stabilize. At some point, continuation became counterproductive. Ancient narratives hint that humanity was reaching a fragile stage of development. Consciousness was expanding, social structures were forming, identity was taking root. If Nibiru continued its regular returns, humanity would remain trapped in an endless loop of rise and collapse, never advancing beyond survival and myth. For progress to occur, interruption had to stop. Nibiru had to be removed from the immediate equation. This is where the idea of intervention emerges, not destruction, not abandonment, but delay. The Anunnaki did not erase Nibiru from existence. They altered humanity's relationship with it. They withdrew direct guidance, restricted knowledge of the cycle, and allowed memory to fade. Over time, Nibiru became legend rather than expectation. Fear turned into disbelief, preparation turned into ridicule, and that was precisely the point. A world that expects a reset cannot evolve freely, but a world that forgets the reset may finally grow beyond it. This appears to have been the calculated risk. Humanity was given autonomy, along with the danger that autonomy brings: wars, collapse, amnesia, but also creativity, innovation, and identity independent of constant oversight. Nibiru's absence was not mercy. It was opportunity. The problem is that opportunity does not last forever. Ancient texts imply that the delay was temporary, not permanent. A pause in the cycle, not its cancellation. Nibiru was never destroyed, only postponed. Its return was always possible, but conditional. It would only come back if humanity reached a point where forgetting became dangerous again, where imbalance outweighed growth. This reframes the present moment in a disturbing way. If Nibiru was never supposed to return, yet signs suggest it may be doing so, then something has gone wrong. Either humanity has crossed a threshold it was warned not to cross, or the conditions that justified the delay no longer exist. In both cases, the implication is the same: the pause is ending. The fear expressed in ancient warnings was not about annihilation, it was about regression, about losing the fragile progress humanity had made during the long absence. A return would not wipe humanity out, but it would reorder it. Knowledge would be redistributed. Power would shift. Systems built on denial of cycles would fail first. Those who understood the old patterns would adapt faster than those who believed history was linear and permanent. This is why the idea of Nibiru's return feels so threatening to modern structures. Our civilization is built on continuity. Markets assume tomorrow will resemble today. Governments assume control can be sustained indefinitely. Identity assumes permanence. A returning cycle undermines all of that. It introduces a force that does not negotiate, does not explain, and does not care about human timelines. The Anunnaki, according to these accounts, understood this risk deeply. Their decision to step back was not abandonment, but containment. By allowing humanity to forget Nibiru, they reduced its psychological power. Fear dissipated, myth softened, life went on. But the cost of forgetting was ignorance. Humanity lost context, lost origin, lost awareness of the larger system it belonged to. That loss was acceptable only temporarily. Forgetting was safe only while humanity remained within certain bounds. The danger arises when humanity begins to act as if it is the highest authority in existence. When it assumes total ownership of Earth, space, and future cycles without understanding the consequences. That kind of imbalance, ancient texts suggest, is what triggers return. This is why Nibiru was never supposed to return casually. Its return is not a routine orbit. It is a response. A correction, a sign that the system is adjusting itself, and systems do not adjust gently when imbalance grows unchecked. The unsettling question, then, is not whether Nibiru exists, but why now? Why, after thousands of years of silence, are signals, anomalies, and ancient narratives aligning again? Why does modern observation feel uncomfortably close to ancient expectation? These are not coincidences that bring comfort. They are convergences that demand attention. There is also the suggestion that some knowledge of this delay survived, that certain groups, certain traditions, understood that Nibiru's absence was temporary, that its return would be preceded by subtle signs rather than dramatic announcement, signals rather than spectacles, that those who were meant to notice would recognize the pattern, not because they were told directly, but because something within them would remember. This is where the story becomes deeply personal. If Nibiru was never supposed to return, yet appears to be doing so, then humanity is being tested in a way it has not experienced in recorded history, not tested for obedience, but for awareness, for the ability to recognize cycles without collapsing into fear or denial. As you're listening to this, consider what feels more unsettling: the idea that Nibiru is returning, or the idea that it was held back for our sake. One implies threat, the other implies responsibility, and responsibility is often the heavier burden. Before we move forward into the ancient texts that describe how this return would be signaled, I want to pause and bring your voice into this moment. Scroll down and leave a comment with something like, "It was delayed on purpose," or "We weren't ready before," if this resonates with you. Even a short phrase like, "The cycle is restarting," helps shape this conversation. And if this deeper exploration into Nibiru, the Anunnaki, and suppressed cycles is keeping you engaged, make sure to like the video so others who are questioning these patterns can find it. Because what comes next builds directly on this idea and reveals how the return was meant to be recognized, not announced. Long before humanity had instruments capable of scanning the depths of space, ancient civilizations spoke of signals that would precede great change. Not messages written in words, not voices from the sky, but signs woven into the fabric of the heavens themselves. These texts do not describe sudden arrivals or dramatic announcements. They describe warnings that arrive quietly, gradually, almost politely, as if giving humanity time to notice before understanding becomes unavoidable. What makes these ancient texts so unsettling is their restraint. They do not scream catastrophe. They do not predict instant destruction. Instead, they describe recognition, a moment when those who are watching the sky realize that something familiar has returned. Familiar not because it has been seen before in living memory, but because it was inherited through knowledge passed down from a time before forgetting. Many of these records describe a sequence rather than an event. First, there is confusion. Observers notice movements that do not align with known stars or planets. Then comes debate. Scholars, priests, or keepers of knowledge argue over interpretation. Some insist it is natural, others sense intention. Only later does certainty begin to form, when patterns repeat and align with older warnings preserved in sacred or restricted texts. What stands out across cultures is the idea that the signal is not visual alone. It is described as a disruption in order, a change in timing, a disturbance that affects not just the sky, but human awareness. Crops fail unexpectedly. Leaders behave erratically. Social structures weaken. The sky is not blamed directly, but it is always present in the background, watching silently as the world begins to feel unstable. In some traditions, the signal is described as a returning light that does not behave like a star. It does not stay fixed. It does not follow the familiar paths of wandering planets. Instead, it appears to pause, shift, or adjust as if responding to observation. This detail is critical. Ancient people were deeply familiar with the sky. They knew what belonged there and what did not. When something violated that familiarity, it was recorded carefully. Other texts describe the signal as soundless communication, not something heard, but something sensed, a knowing that spreads among those attuned to ancient cycles. This is often misunderstood by modern readers as spiritual language, but within the context of the time, it was observational. The ancients did not separate awareness from environment the way we do. Changes in the sky were felt psychologically and socially, not just measured. What ties these texts together is their insistence that the signal is intentional. It is not an accident of nature. It appears when humanity reaches a certain state, when imbalance grows too large, or when knowledge drifts too far from origin. The signal does not force action. It invites response. Those who recognize it prepare. Those who ignore it continue as before, unaware of what is unfolding around them. The Anunnaki appear repeatedly in these descriptions, not as the signal itself, but as its authors. The texts suggest that the signal is a marker placed long ago, designed to activate only under specific conditions. This marker was not meant for early humanity. It was meant for a future civilization capable of observing without understanding, questioning without certainty. In other words, us. Ancient scribes wrote as if they knew their words would not be fully understood when written. They encoded meaning through metaphor, repetition, and structure rather than clarity. This was not poetic indulgence, it was preservation strategy. Literal explanations are fragile. Metaphors survive conquest, censorship, and translation. The message could be distorted, but the pattern would remain. One recurring phrase across different traditions is the idea of the sky remembering. This concept suggests that the heavens themselves carry memory, that events leave traces which return when conditions repeat. To modern ears, this sounds mystical. To ancient observers, it was practical. They understood cycles in nature intimately. Floods returned, droughts returned, stars returned. Why would greater cycles behave differently? These texts also warn against impatience. The signal is never described as immediate confirmation. It unfolds slowly. Those who rush to declare certainty are portrayed as misguided. Understanding comes only through observation over time. This patience is emphasized repeatedly, suggesting that the true danger is not the signal itself, but humanity's reaction to it. Another unsettling detail is that the signal is described as selective. Not everyone notices it. Not everyone is meant to. Awareness depends on attention, not status. Kings miss it. Priests argue over it. Ordinary observers sometimes recognize it first. This detail undermines hierarchy and reinforces the idea that recognition is internal, not granted by authority. Some texts go further, suggesting that the signal is deliberately ambiguous. It can be dismissed by those who wish to dismiss it. It does not force belief. This ambiguity protects free will. Humanity is not compelled to acknowledge the cycle. It is given the opportunity to choose awareness or denial. That choice, according to the texts, determines how the cycle unfolds. What makes these ancient descriptions feel uncomfortably modern is how closely they align with present experience. Anomalies appear. Experts disagree. Official explanations feel incomplete. Public attention fluctuates between fascination and dismissal. The pattern repeats almost exactly as described, despite thousands of years separating observer from observer. These texts never describe the signal as the end. They describe it as the beginning of remembering, a phase where humanity is invited to reconnect with suppressed knowledge about its origins, its role, and its limitations. The danger is not destruction, but misinterpretation. Those who mistake the signal for threat alone miss its purpose entirely. There is also a recurring warning about noise. When the signal appears, false explanations multiply, distractions increase, conflicting narratives emerge. This is not random. The texts suggest that confusion is a natural defense mechanism of societies facing uncomfortable truth. When certainty feels threatened, noise becomes protection. What is perhaps most unsettling is that these ancient texts do not express hope or fear about the signal. They express acceptance, as if the return was never a question of if, but when. Humanity's role was never to stop it, only to decide how to respond. This calm acknowledgement contrasts sharply with modern anxiety, suggesting that ancient observers were far more comfortable with their place in a larger system. As we continue unfolding this story, keep in mind that these texts were not written to convince. They were written to endure. Their purpose was not belief, but recognition. And recognition does not happen all at once. It happens slowly, quietly, as fragments begin to align. Before we move deeper into how these signals connect to repeating historical collapses and resets, I want to hear from you. Scroll down and leave a comment with something like, "The ancients warned us," or "This signal was predicted," if this resonates. Even a short phrase like "this matches the texts" helps keep this discussion alive. And if this exploration of ancient records, returning signals and hidden cycles is holding your attention, make sure to like the video so others searching for these connections can find it too. We're about to take the next step, and it builds directly on everything these ancient warnings were trying to preserve. At some point, denial stops working, not because proof becomes overwhelming, but because repetition becomes impossible to dismiss. A single anomaly can be ignored, two can be debated. But when the same sequence appears again and again across time, cultures, and collapsed civilizations, it stops being coincidence and starts becoming a pattern. And this is the moment humanity always reaches just before everything changes. What makes this pattern so disturbing is not how dramatic it is, but how consistent it remains. Ancient civilizations did not fall randomly. They collapsed in waves. Each wave followed a familiar rhythm: rapid advancement, sudden imbalance, internal fragmentation, and then a quiet disappearance that left behind ruins but very little explanation. When historians examine these collapses in isolation, they seem unrelated. But when viewed together, they align too perfectly to ignore. The pattern always begins the same way. A civilization reaches a peak of confidence. Technology advances, power concentrates. Humanity begins to believe it has mastered its environment, its future, even the heavens. This is when the sky becomes background instead of authority. The stars are admired, not watched. Warnings are preserved as myths rather than instructions. And slowly, the connection between humanity and the cycles above it weakens. Then, anomalies appear. Not catastrophes at first, but disturbances, climate irregularities, social unrest, sudden shifts in leadership. Knowledge that once flowed freely becomes controlled or lost. These signs are never interpreted as connected. Each is treated as a separate problem. And that fragmentation of understanding is itself part of the pattern. Ancient records describe this stage with unsettling clarity. They speak of a time when the watchers turn their gaze back toward Earth, not because humanity has failed, but because it has forgotten its origins, forgotten its limits, forgotten that it exists within a system far older and far larger than itself. This forgetting is not accidental. It is the natural outcome of progress without memory. The next phase is recognition, but only among a few. Observers notice alignments between celestial anomalies and earthly instability. They sense repetition, déjà vu on a civilizational scale, but their warnings are dismissed because the dominant culture no longer believes in cycles, it believes in permanence. And permanence is a powerful illusion. This pattern is visible in ancient ruins scattered across the world. Structures that appear suddenly advanced, then abandoned just as suddenly. Knowledge that seems to arrive fully formed, then vanish without explanation. These civilizations did not slowly decline, they were interrupted. Something changed the rules faster than they could adapt. What connects these moments is timing. The collapses align with periods described in ancient texts as times of return, not necessarily of physical arrival, but of influence. Moments when the balance between Earth and the greater system was adjusted. Humanity did not end, but it was reshaped. Memory was thinned, power redistributed, the cycle reset just enough to continue. The modern discomfort comes from recognizing the same early signs today. Not identical, but familiar. Rapid technological acceleration, fragmented truth, increasing noise and distraction. A growing obsession with origins, paired with an equally strong resistance to uncomfortable answers. These are not random trends. They are symptoms of a civilization approaching the same threshold others have crossed before. The Anunnaki narratives describe this pattern not as punishment, but as correction. When humanity drifts too far from alignment, the system responds. Not emotionally, procedurally. Just as nature corrects imbalance through storms or extinction, the larger cycle corrects civilizational imbalance through resets. This idea is deeply unsettling because it removes morality from collapse. There is no villain, no savior, only process. This is why the pattern has been so difficult to accept. Humans prefer stories with agency, heroes and enemies, but the pattern offers neither. It suggests that humanity is subject to forces that do not care about intention, only alignment. And alignment is measured over long spans of time, not single lifetimes. Another element of the pattern is selective survival. Ancient accounts never describe total annihilation, they describe thinning, preservation of fragments, enough people, enough knowledge, enough memory to allow the next cycle to begin. This explains why humanity always seems to restart with echoes of what came before. Flood myths, sky gods, lost golden ages. These are not inventions, they are remnants. What is perhaps most unsettling is that the pattern includes resistance itself. Every civilization facing this threshold produces skeptics, debunkers and authorities who insist nothing unusual is happening. This is not portrayed as malice in ancient texts, but as inevitability. Denial is part of the cycle. It delays panic, but it also delays preparation. The pattern also explains why ancient knowledge was fragmented rather than centralized. No single text holds the full picture. No single culture preserved the entire memory. This distribution protected the knowledge from being completely erased. Even if one civilization fell, fragments survived elsewhere. The pattern anticipated collapse and adapted to it. When modern researchers notice similarities between ancient collapses, they often stop short of connecting them to celestial cycles. That connection feels too uncomfortable, too disruptive. But ancient observers made no such separation. For them, sky and earth were inseparable. What happened above shaped what happened below. Ignoring that relationship was considered dangerous. The return of anomalies like unexplained signals, unusual trajectories, and objects that defy easy classification fits perfectly into this pattern, not as isolated events, but as early indicators. Signals that the cycle is approaching another transition point, not tomorrow, not suddenly, but inevitably. This is why the pattern cannot be ignored forever. Because it does not announce itself with catastrophe, it announces itself with familiarity, a sense that history is repeating, not exactly, but close enough to feel wrong. Close enough to trigger unease rather than fear, and unease is harder to dismiss. As you listen to this, you may notice that the pattern feels less like a theory and more like recognition. That reaction matters. Ancient texts suggest that recognition is the true signal. Not the sky itself, but the moment when humanity collectively begins to sense repetition. That is when the cycle accelerates. The danger is not in the pattern itself. The danger is in misunderstanding it. Civilizations that panicked collapsed faster. Those that denied collapsed unprepared. The few that adapted left behind knowledge that survived the reset. This is why ancient warnings emphasize awareness rather than resistance. You cannot stop the cycle, but you can move through it with understanding. This brings us to the most uncomfortable realization of all. If this pattern is real, then humanity has faced it before and failed to fully remember, which means the real test is not technological, political, or scientific. It is psychological. Can a civilization acknowledge its place in a repeating system without collapsing under the weight of that knowledge? As we move forward, this pattern will become harder to ignore. Not because evidence will suddenly become undeniable, but because alignment will continue. More anomalies, more echoes, more fragments clicking into place, and the conversation will shift from whether the pattern exists to what humanity should do about it. Before we continue into the most unsettling implication of this pattern, the possibility that humanity is being observed again, I want to hear from you. Scroll down and leave a comment with a phrase like "history is repeating" or "this pattern is real" if this resonates. Even something simple like "I see the cycle" helps keep this discussion alive. And if this deep dive into ancient cycles, Anunnaki influence and repeating resets is holding your attention, make sure to like the video so others who feel this same unease can find it too. What comes next builds directly on this pattern, and it brings us face to face with the watchers themselves. The question of whether humanity is being observed again is not as dramatic as it sounds. It doesn't begin with fear, panic, or the sudden appearance of something unmistakable in the sky. It begins with a feeling, a subtle shift in awareness, a sense that attention has returned. Ancient texts never described observation as obvious or invasive. They described it as quiet, distant, and patient. Observation, in their view, was never about interference. It was about assessment. According to those records, the Anunnaki did not constantly watch humanity. That would have been unnecessary. Observation only resumed at specific points in the cycle, moments when humanity reached a threshold where its choices began to affect more than just itself. These were moments of expansion, when technology, influence, and ambition grew faster than wisdom. Observation was not surveillance, it was evaluation. What makes this idea unsettling today is not the possibility of being watched, but the possibility of being measured. Measurement implies criteria. It implies that humanity's progress is not judged by comfort or achievement, but by alignment. Alignment with cycles, balance, and restraint. Ancient warnings suggest that when humanity drifts too far from these principles, attention returns to correct course, not through direct control, but through consequence. The Anunnaki were often referred to not simply as gods, but as watchers. That word appears again and again in different forms across ancient cultures. Watchers are not rulers. They are not conquerors. They observe patterns, intervene only when thresholds are crossed, and withdraw when balance is restored. This role explains their long absences far better than the idea of abandonment. From this perspective, observation is cyclical, not constant. Humanity is left alone long enough to develop identity, culture, and agency. Only when that development begins to threaten the larger system does observation resume. This is why ancient texts describe long ages of silence, followed by sudden periods of heightened awareness. The silence was not absence, it was permission. The modern world struggles with this idea because we associate observation with control, cameras, monitoring, surveillance states. But ancient observation was different. It was cosmic rather than personal. Humanity as a whole was observed, not individuals. Trends mattered more than actions. Direction mattered more than detail. This is where the current moment feels uncomfortably familiar. Humanity has reached a level of technological power where its actions extend beyond Earth. Space is no longer distant. It is being entered, altered, claimed. The sky is no longer sacred or mysterious. It is treated as territory. Ancient texts suggest this is precisely the point at which observation resumes, not because humanity is curious, but because it is expanding without context. The Anunnaki narratives repeatedly warn against unchecked expansion. Growth without memory leads to imbalance. Imbalance triggers correction. Observation precedes correction. This sequence appears again and again in ancient accounts, described not emotionally, but mechanically. The signs of renewed observation were never meant to be obvious. They were meant to be plausible, dismissible, easy to ignore for those who are not paying attention. Ancient texts describe subtle indicators, anomalies that provoke debate, signals that can be explained away, patterns that only become clear over time. Observation does not announce itself. It reveals itself through consistency. What makes the idea of observation resonate now is how many independent threads are converging. Anomalous objects, unexplained signals, renewed interest in ancient origins, a growing discomfort with official explanations. None of these alone prove anything. Together they form a familiar shape, a shape ancient observers described with quiet certainty. Another unsettling aspect is that observation is not portrayed as hostile. The texts do not describe fear of the watchers. They describe respect, even resignation. The watchers are not enemies. They are caretakers of process. From a human perspective, this feels cold, but from a systemic perspective, it is logical. Systems preserve balance, not sentiment. This reframing forces an uncomfortable question. If humanity is being observed again, what is being assessed? Ancient records suggest several criteria: how humanity treats its environment, how it handles power, whether knowledge is used to dominate or to understand, whether progress is guided by awareness or driven by arrogance. These are not moral judgments. They are indicators of stability. The idea that humanity is being observed again also explains the growing sense of urgency without clarity. Many people feel that something is coming, yet cannot articulate what. This mirrors descriptions in ancient texts of pre-recognition phases, a time when awareness spreads unevenly. Some feel anticipation, others feel anxiety, most feel confusion. This psychological state is not accidental. It is part of the process. Observation also implies restraint on the observer's part. The Anunnaki did not intervene immediately, according to these accounts. They watched long enough to understand whether humanity would self-correct. Only when imbalance persisted did correction follow. This suggests that the current moment is not one of action, but of watching, of waiting. That waiting is perhaps the most unsettling element. It means the outcome is not fixed. Humanity's response matters. Awareness matters. Recognition matters. Ancient warnings emphasize that civilizations which recognized the cycle early adapted better than those that denied it entirely. Observation did not guarantee collapse. It increased the likelihood of transformation. This perspective also challenges modern assumptions about contact. People imagine observation leading to revelation, disclosure, or arrival. Ancient texts suggest otherwise. Observation leads first to testing through pressure, through challenge, through situations that reveal priorities and values. Only later, if alignment is restored or decisively lost, does the cycle move forward. As you listen to this, consider how different this idea is from common narratives about extraterrestrial contact. There are no messages, no landings, no announcements, just attention, quiet, patient, and deeply consequential. That kind of observation is far more difficult to dismiss because it does not rely on spectacle. The Anunnaki's hidden astronomical knowledge fits perfectly into this framework. They understood when observation was necessary and when withdrawal was more effective. Their greatest influence may not have been what they did, but when they chose not to act. Allowing humanity to struggle, forget, and rediscover was part of the design. If observation has resumed, then humanity is approaching another decision point. Not a single moment, but a phase, a narrowing of possibilities. Ancient texts describe this phase as unstable, filled with contradiction, great innovation alongside great destruction, heightened awareness alongside profound distraction. This duality is not accidental. It reveals which tendencies dominate. The most uncomfortable implication of all is that observation does not guarantee preservation. It guarantees assessment. Civilizations that aligned with the larger system continued in altered form. Those that did not faded into memory, leaving behind ruins and warnings for the next cycle. This is not punishment. It is selection through process. As we move deeper into this subject, the question shifts again, from whether humanity is being observed to what happens when observation turns into confirmation, because ancient texts suggest there is a moment when watching ends and response begins. That moment is never announced. It is only recognized in hindsight. Before we continue into what that response may look like and how it has unfolded in past cycles, I want to pause and bring your voice into this conversation. Scroll down and leave a comment with something like, "We are being watched," or "Observation has returned," if this resonates with you. Even a short phrase like "This feels familiar" helps signal that you're connecting with these ideas. And if this exploration into the Anunnaki ancient cycles and the possibility of renewed observation is keeping you engaged, make sure to like the video so others who are questioning these patterns can find it too. What comes next builds directly on this moment of observation, and it leads into the most revealing phase of the cycle. The oldest secret was never hidden in a single place. It was scattered, diluted, reshaped, and passed forward through fragments of memory that humanity learned to ignore. And that is precisely why it survived. Secrets locked away are eventually discovered or destroyed. But secrets embedded into culture, myth, and instinct can wait indefinitely. What we are witnessing now is not the sudden revelation of something new, but the slow resurfacing of something humanity has always carried, just beneath awareness. Ancient civilizations did not speak of this secret as forbidden knowledge in the modern sense. They treated it as dangerous knowledge, not because it was evil, but because it altered how humanity understood itself. Once this secret was fully recognized, humanity could no longer see itself as isolated, self-originating, or fully in control of its destiny. That shift in perspective was destabilizing. It dissolved certainty. And civilizations built on certainty do not survive such realizations intact. At the center of this resurfacing is a single unsettling idea. Humanity is not the first intelligent civilization shaped by forces beyond Earth, and it may not be the last. The Anunnaki narratives were never meant to elevate humanity or diminish it. They were meant to place humanity in context. A context that stretches far beyond recorded history, far beyond a single planet, and far beyond the comforting illusion of uniqueness. The oldest secret is not that beings came from the sky. Many cultures say that. The secret is why they came, why they left, and why they allowed humanity to forget them. According to ancient accounts, forgetting was not a failure of memory. It was an engineered condition. Humanity was never meant to carry full awareness continuously. Full awareness too early would have stalled development, trapping civilization in dependence and fear. So memory was thinned, knowledge was fragmented, and humanity was left to grow without constant reference to its origins. This explains why the secret resurfaces only at certain moments, not randomly, but cyclically. When humanity reaches a point where its power begins to rival its understanding, the fragments begin to align again. Ancient texts resurface, patterns become visible, anomalies appear in the sky. The past begins to feel closer than it should. These are not accidents, they are triggers. The resurfacing of this secret also explains the deep discomfort it causes. It does not fit neatly into belief systems or scientific frameworks. It challenges both. To accept it fully requires humility on a civilizational scale. It requires admitting that humanity's story is part of a much larger process, one that includes guidance, correction, and cycles of forgetting and remembering. The Anunnaki were never portrayed as omnipotent gods. They were portrayed as custodians of a process. Their greatest power was not technology, but timing. They understood when to intervene and when to withdraw. They understood that humanity needed struggle to develop identity, creativity, and resilience. Too much guidance would have produced obedience, not intelligence. Too little would have resulted in chaos. Balance required absence as much as presence. This is why the oldest secret feels less like revelation and more like recognition. Many people who encounter these ideas report a strange familiarity, not belief, but resonance, as if something long suppressed is stirring again. Ancient texts anticipated this reaction. They describe awakening not as sudden clarity, but as gradual alignment, pieces clicking into place, questions that no longer feel abstract. The resurfacing of this secret is also deeply threatening to systems built on control. If humanity accepts that it has been guided, corrected, and observed across cycles, then no single institution holds ultimate authority. Knowledge becomes decentralized, history becomes provisional, power structures lose their claim to permanence. This is not speculation. Ancient collapses show exactly what happens when dominant narratives fracture under the weight of forgotten truth. That is why resurfacing is never allowed to be clean or complete. The secret does not return as a clear announcement. It returns as noise, contradiction, debate, and confusion. Truth and distraction rise together. This is not failure. It is protection. Only those willing to navigate ambiguity can approach understanding. Those seeking certainty retreat into denial or fanaticism. The oldest secret also reframes humanity's fear of the unknown. If the Anunnaki and similar beings existed, then the universe is not indifferent, but it is also not sentimental. Humanity matters, but not uniquely. Earth matters, but not centrally. This perspective is unsettling because it strips away the comfort of exceptionalism while offering something far more demanding: responsibility. Responsibility to understand cycles rather than deny them. Responsibility to recognize limits rather than assume dominance. Responsibility to use knowledge as alignment rather than control. Ancient texts emphasize that civilizations which understood this secret survived transitions differently than those that rejected it. Survival was not guaranteed, but continuity was. As this secret resurfaces, it also exposes why humanity's progress feels uneven. Bursts of advancement followed by collapse. Periods of enlightenment followed by regression. These are not failures. They are symptoms of a system designed to prevent stagnation. Forgetting resets curiosity. Loss forces rediscovery. Each cycle refines awareness, even if memory is sacrificed along the way. The modern world is struggling because it has reached a level of power without the corresponding humility. Technology accelerates faster than wisdom. Information multiplies faster than understanding. The resurfacing of the oldest secret interrupts that imbalance. It forces humanity to ask questions it has avoided for centuries. Not just where we came from, but who decides when progress goes too far. This is why the resurfacing feels urgent but undefined. There is no single event to point to, no moment of confirmation. Instead, there is convergence, ancient warnings aligning with modern observation, forgotten ideas re-entering mainstream conversation, an increasing sense that history is pressing forward rather than staying behind. The secret also reframes fear itself. If humanity is being observed, measured, or corrected, then fear is not useful. Panic accelerates collapse. Denial ensures unpreparedness. Ancient texts repeatedly emphasize awareness as the only meaningful response. Awareness does not stop the cycle. It changes how one moves through it. What is resurfacing now is not proof, but permission. Permission to question official histories. Permission to re-examine ancient records without dismissal. Permission to consider that humanity's origins may be more complex, more layered, and more cosmic than previously allowed. That permission is dangerous because it cannot be easily revoked. As more people begin to sense this resurfacing, the conversation will fragment. Some will turn it into belief systems, others will weaponize it, many will reject it outright. This too is anticipated. The secret does not resurface to unify humanity. It resurfaces to reveal tendencies. How humanity reacts is part of what is being observed. The most unsettling aspect of the oldest secret is that it suggests humanity has faced this moment before. Faced it, fragmented, and forgotten. which means the real question is not whether this secret is true, but whether this time will be different, whether humanity can remember without collapsing, whether awareness can coexist with stability. As you listen to this, notice how it reframes everything discussed so far. The signal, the anomalies, the ancient warnings, the patterns, the observation, they are not isolated mysteries. They are symptoms of resurfacing, of something long suppressed pushing back into awareness because the conditions are right. Before we continue into what happens when this resurfacing reaches its critical point, I want to bring you directly into this moment. Scroll down and leave a comment with something like, "The secret is returning," or "This was never forgotten," if this resonates. Even a short phrase like, "This explains everything," helps deepen the conversation. And if this exploration into the Anunnaki, Nibiru, ancient cycles, and humanity's hidden past is keeping you engaged, make sure to like the video so others who feel this same recognition can find it too. Because what comes next builds directly on this resurfacing and moves us closer to the moment when remembering becomes unavoidable. If the signal is not natural, then everything discussed so far shifts from speculation into implication. Because a non-natural signal does not exist by accident. It exists because something wanted it to exist. Intention becomes unavoidable, and intention changes the rules of interpretation completely. A natural phenomenon can be studied without asking why it happened. Gravity does not have motive. Radiation does not have purpose. But a signal that carries structure, timing, restraint, and persistence forces a different kind of question. Not what is it, but who is it for? And once that question is asked, humanity is no longer just an observer of the universe. It becomes part of a conversation it may not yet understand. Ancient texts warned repeatedly that the most dangerous moment is not arrival, but recognition. The moment when humanity realizes that something in the sky is responding rather than drifting. That moment fractures certainty, because if the signal is not natural, then it is not random. And if it is not random, then someone accounted for humanity's existence long before we were capable of noticing. This idea is deeply destabilizing because it reverses perspective. Humanity stops being the center looking outward and becomes the subject being evaluated from afar. The sky is no longer empty space waiting to be explored. It becomes a layered system already occupied, already active, already aware. And that awareness does not need to announce itself loudly. It only needs to be undeniable to those paying attention. If the signal is artificial, then it is also restrained. Ancient records emphasize this detail again and again. Whatever communicates through the heavens does not overwhelm. It does not force belief. It operates at the threshold of dismissal. Always just subtle enough to be ignored by those who need certainty, and just precise enough to be recognized by those who sense patterns. This restraint is not weakness. It is control. The Anunnaki narratives align perfectly with this behavior. They were never described as invaders or conquerors. They were described as administrators of cycles. They understood that forcing awareness too early would fracture societies beyond recovery. So they worked through timing, symbols, and delayed recognition. A non-natural signal fits this logic exactly. It allows humanity to choose how it responds. If the signal is not natural, then the silence surrounding it becomes meaningful. Silence is not absence. Silence is strategy. Ancient texts suggest that advanced intelligences do not communicate through constant presence, but through thresholds. They wait until a civilization reaches a point where it can no longer dismiss the implications of what it is seeing. Only then does recognition begin. This is why the question is not whether the signal is artificial, but what stage of the process humanity is currently in. Ancient warnings describe phases. First comes anomaly, then debate, then normalization, then realization. Humanity does not leap from ignorance to certainty. It drifts into awareness slowly, resisting at every step. If the signal is not natural, then humanity is not being contacted in the way popular imagination expects. There is no greeting, no disclosure, no arrival. Instead, there is pressure, cognitive pressure, the pressure of patterns refusing to disappear, the pressure of ancient warnings aligning with modern observation, the pressure of realizing that official explanations no longer feel sufficient. This kind of pressure forces self-assessment. Ancient texts describe this as the true purpose of the signal, not to announce presence, but to provoke evaluation. How does humanity react when confronted with the possibility that it is not alone, not central, and not fully autonomous? Does it respond with humility or denial, curiosity or aggression, awareness or fear? These responses matter because, according to ancient accounts, they influence what comes next. A civilization that reacts with panic accelerates collapse. A civilization that reacts with denial becomes unprepared. But a civilization that reacts with awareness gains time. Not safety, time. Time to adapt, reinterpret, and realign. If the signal is not natural, then it also explains why no single authority seems fully in control of the narrative. Information fragments, interpretations conflict, certainty dissolves. This is not failure, this is containment. No single group is meant to own the truth. Centralized understanding would collapse too quickly under its own weight. Fragmentation slows the process, allowing awareness to spread unevenly rather than explosively. Ancient civilizations understood this instinctively. That is why their knowledge was encoded into myth rather than written as instruction manuals. Myths survive collapse, manuals do not. If the signal is artificial, then it follows the same logic. It is not designed to be understood quickly. It is designed to endure. Another unsettling implication is that a non-natural signal implies monitoring over long spans of time. You do not place a marker or construct a signal unless you expect someone to eventually notice it. That expectation requires patience, measured not in decades, but in millennia. This alone suggests intelligence operating on timescales far beyond human planning. The Anunnaki were described as beings comfortable with long cycles. Their actions were not rushed. Their decisions unfolded across generations of humans. This patience explains why the signal feels ancient rather than urgent. It is not calling humanity to act immediately. It is calling humanity to recognize where it stands in a larger sequence. If the signal is not natural, then humanity's current technological moment becomes highly relevant. We are capable of observing, measuring, and questioning, but not yet capable of full comprehension. This intermediate stage is exactly what ancient texts describe as the window of recognition. Awareness begins before understanding. Discomfort precedes clarity. This also explains why fear is such a poor response. Fear narrows perception. Ancient warnings emphasize that fear blinds civilizations at precisely the moment they need expanded awareness. A non-natural signal is not a threat by default. It becomes threatening only when misunderstood. The most uncomfortable implication of all is that a non-natural signal suggests expectation, not hope, not intention to save or destroy. Expectation that humanity will reveal its nature through response. That observation will turn into confirmation. Confirmation not of presence, but of trajectory. If humanity responds by attempting dominance, exploitation, or denial, the cycle follows one path. If it responds with curiosity, restraint, and awareness, the cycle follows another. The signal itself does not decide the outcome. Humanity's reaction does. Ancient texts describe moments like this as narrowing corridors. Possibilities still exist, but fewer than before. Choices matter more. Consequences arrive faster. This is why the signal is described as the beginning of pressure rather than the beginning of contact. As this idea settles in, notice how it reframes everything discussed so far. The anomalies are no longer random. The resurfacing of ancient knowledge is no longer coincidence. The discomfort felt across institutions, cultures, and individuals is no longer irrational. It is the psychological effect of approaching recognition. If the signal is not natural, then humanity is standing at the edge of remembering something it was never meant to remember all at once. And that process is not gentle. It unfolds through tension, contradiction, and uncertainty. Before we continue into what ancient cycles suggest happens after this phase of recognition, I want to bring you into this moment. Scroll down and leave a comment with a phrase like, "This signal is intentional," or "This isn't random." If this resonates with you, even something simple like "We are being tested" adds depth to this conversation. And if this exploration into artificial signals, Anunnaki influence, and hidden cosmic processes is keeping you engaged, make sure to like the video so others who are questioning these same patterns can find it too, because what comes next builds directly on this realization, and it moves us into the phase where choice begins to matter. If you've stayed with me all the way to the end of this video, that tells me one important thing. You're not just watching, you're paying attention. And attention is exactly what this topic demands. So if you haven't subscribed yet, now is the moment. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss what comes next, because the next video continues this story right where we left off, and it goes even deeper into what these signals may truly mean. If you reached the end, I want you to leave a comment so I know you were here. Comment the words, "I'm still watching," or "The signal is real." Choose the one that resonates most with you. Reading your comments helps keep this conversation alive and lets me know how far this message is reaching. And don't forget to leave a like. If you made it to the end, that like tells the algorithm this kind of deep, thought-provoking content matters, and it helps more people who are questioning ancient history, the Anunnaki, and hidden cosmic cycles find this video. Now stay right here and click on the next video appearing on your screen. It connects directly to everything we've just uncovered, and it may change the way you see the sky, the past, and our future even more.